Yes, thank you for you guys' time. Appreciate you guys checking out the first installment on the Forgotten Slaves channel here on YouTube. It's definitely a pleasure and an honor to be able to present this information to you. Um, Without further ado, we'll dive right into it. Of course, as you can follow along with the visuals that correspond with the readings I'm providing to you now. But as you guys know, there's been quite a bit of talk, conspiracy theories, sort of an enigma, if you will, pertaining to the quote unquote plight of the African American in this country. Um, Ultimately, there have been several hurdles placed along the way that ultimately have contributed to not only the demise of the African American structure as far as the household, but have also caused irreversible damage to the culture at this point. Just to go ahead and get started, um, just to pick a point in time to really begin everything, we'll start from the 1970s. In the 1970s, Richard M. Nixon um, sat in office. President um, headed the White House, of course. He was the very first to have coined the phrase war on drugs. Now, of course, since then, in which the 1970s leading all the way up to now, 2017, is about 15 years in gap as far as time. And in that time frame, the war on drugs has quote unquote continued. However, to this day, drugs run rampant throughout the African American community, despite the fact that African Americans do not own, possess, or run any type of manufacturing, warehousing, or processing plant for any illegal drugs, especially those considered hard drugs, pretty much outside the realm of marijuana and drugs similar to that. Um, but ultimately, the household of the African American was heavily damaged by this quote unquote war on drugs that has continued up until this very day. Now, as I said a moment ago, African Americans do not have the means to manufacture or create any other drugs that are so very much associated with this culture and this race, nor do they have the manufacturing capabilities to design any type of weaponry. Um, that includes any type of handguns, rifles, semi-automatic or automatic weapons for that matter as well. So despite the fact that the African Americans do not possess the ability to create um, such items and products, they still find their way into the community. Um, Now, as I said, we'll start with the 70s with Richard Nixon. He initiated the very first call to action on the war of drugs, at least as far as on an administrative level for a president. From that point forward, many laws, all the way down to state regulations, have been set in play that have ultimately impacted not only the present state but also the future state of the African American community. Now, the catch with all of this is we're not referring to the use of drugs per se. Though the use of drugs has unquestionably damaged the African American community and the African American household, our point today focuses on the incarceration associated with drugs. Ultimately, any type of possession with intent to sell, simple possession for that matter as well, but possession with intent to sell, distribute, possession with intent to sell, manufacture, trafficking, all of those connotations carry certain rules and regulations that are, to say the very least, extreme in comparison to the actual crime itself. Um, as I said, the use of drugs has definitely impacted the African American community. Of course, if there is no demand, then of course there's no need to supply. Simple rules of business and economics. But ultimately, the dealing, the selling, the manufacturing, and distributing has been far more of a harm to the African American household than the usage probably has, just to be completely honest. When you really think about it, the crimes that these guys are facing essentially are nonviolent crimes. However, they carry sentencing and charge power, as in they're capable of receiving a bond similar to that of a murderer or a person who has been charged with some form or degree of murder, manslaughter, or essentially there has been loss of human life. Now, with that being the case, at the rate in which African Americans are being incarcerated or locked up or even just generally charged with drug offenses, that almost certainly increases the likelihood that the people associated with the distribution, possession, manufacturing, and selling will ultimately wind up behind bars. Now, with them ending up behind bars, not only does it adversely affect them, it also adversely affects the household itself. By the male essentially being separated from the household due to drug use or due to the dealing of drugs and his incarceration, ultimately he is separated from the household to whereas he is A, unable to defend, B, unable to provide, and C, unable to provide that authority figure that is required to sustain a successful home. Now, for those who are fortunate enough to receive lesser sentencing, probation, which all carry heavy fines and heavy fees, ultimately, despite the fact that those charged with the selling and distributing and trafficking, etc., obviously have no means of income, more than likely due to the fact of them having to sell the drugs to begin with, they are still placed in a situation of basically having to resort back to the same thing that initially caused them to be locked up to begin with. Now, for those people who are ultimately locked up, incarcerated, there is no program to A, rid the person of any type of addiction if it's a case where they use, and B, there's no type of vocational learning or anything for those who were charged with selling. Therefore, they have no new skills to leave the incarceration with to gain some type of employment. Now, the idea of the employment to begin with for a person who is considered a felon isn't a very gainful one. In fact, it's almost impossible for a person with a criminal background to obtain any type of employment that will be conducive to a successful life by any regard. At bare minimum, they would make enough just to survive and to contribute what part they can to the workforce. Now, ultimately, those same people who have been locked up, once they're released, as I said, there's no programs to prepare them for life outside of prison and to make them a productive citizen. So ultimately, they're left with the option of returning back to what got them in the situation to begin with. Now, for those people who have no connection or cannot relate to this, keep in mind you more than likely have some type of friend, relative, friend of a friend, relative of a friend, someone who is ultimately associated with this in some form or fashion. Either they have used or they've been associated with selling or dealing or something to that effect. Now, in regards to your own personal situation, if you cannot relate to this, I totally understand. But keep in mind, if this was your cousin, or if this was your uncle, or if this was your ex, or if this was your brother or your dad, or something of that effect, then of course it hits closer to home. So the understanding and the accepting of the idea would be a lot simpler. But because many of you may not, then it may be kind of hard for you to grasp and kind of walk down this path because it isn't something that you've had to experience. Now, ultimately, to get back on subject, those people who are affected by the incarceration of the male in the household include not just the person themselves who have been incarcerated and who ultimately won't be able to lead or live a productive life beyond that point without some type of extreme rarity, because as a whole it won't work the same for everyone. There will be a few success stories or a few occasions where people may make a way or devise some type of unique pathway to carve themselves some type of successful life. But for the most part, it won't come to be or come to pass in that way. So as far as those who are affected, it's not only the person, it's also the female in the household, because now the female is left to basically play the role of the provider, in which the African American male once did, and once did very well, I might add. But ultimately, she's left to play that role. Now, with her being left to play that role, that leaves the children at a disadvantage. Not only does it leave the children at a disadvantage, it also causes the female to be dependent on outside sources or outside help, i.e., government assistance, which comes in the form of public housing, Medicaid, food stamps, WIC, Section 8, etc., etc. So there are many other minimal alternatives for the African American female to go and take advantage of. Now, whether they were created with the intention of ultimately replacing African American males or causing females to become more dependent, or simply the idea of having to provide means for the weakest link of society to at least keep up, that remains to be seen. And until I have some concrete evidence to present to you, which I may very soon, we'll just leave it there. But just the idea of separating the male from the household leaves that on the female's shoulder and places her in a position to whereas she's left with being dependent on the government, or as many people refer to, just to be funny, the white man, because we're discussing African Americans at this point. Now, beyond that, once the male is separated from the household and the female is preoccupied with survival, that leaves the children with very little guidance, direction, or leadership. Um, the female in the household, of course, is experiencing or seeing this firsthand. So when she goes through her own situations in the next generation, similar to this, she will handle it very similar to how her mother did. And it always becomes a case of comfortability. You know, if I don't have to do very much to obtain this, then of course, a lot of times I'm going to be more inclined to indulge or take part in it because it doesn't require very much work. And ultimately, that comfortability causes us to become lazy and dependent on things that we shouldn't necessarily need. Um, Now, for the male on side B, the son no longer has a male figure in the household to a use as a role model, b to receive any guidance or direction from. Ultimately, the female in the household is incapable of teaching the male how to be a male. She has no direct experience doing so. So, with that being the case, the son is left to figure it out on his own, which is an environment conducive to mistakes that ultimately may adversely impact this child for the rest of their lives. Now, as far as just the drugs in general, more than likely because the child will grow up in a development, an environment similar to what the father or the dad did, it's highly likely and probable that the child also will indulge in the drugs in some form or fashion, whether he uses or whether he deals. So ultimately, it's like a chain of events, just a simple cycle that is highly likely or highly probable to happen. Of course, there's expectation that there will be exceptions. Everyone won't be affected in this way, or everyone's pathway won't turn out this way. But if you leave an environment for this to happen around the great majority, then ultimately the great majority are going to end up taking part. It's just, simple mathematics. The more something is available, the higher percentage it is that, it will be taken part of. Simple as that. Um, but again, just to get back on topic, as you can see with a lot of the clippings presented, the numbers since the war on drugs back in the 70s and even beforehand, but just more specifically that time frame forward, you can see an increase, just an elevation in not only the incarceration of the African American males, but the disparity between the African American males and every other counterpart. Now, being as we are here in 2017, this information about drugs and how it's impacted the African American community, despite, again, the African American community not having access nor resource to be able to manufacture or create these things, they are just as dominant in our community as they have ever been. Of course, there are drugs that come and go as far as popularity, but essentially the idea of drug usage in the African American community is just as much present now as it's been at any point in the past. That includes the 60s, 70s, the highlights in the 80s, and so on and so forth. So here we are. We have battered and bruised African American community, severely damaged from years and years of the war on drugs being afflicted upon it. And lo and behold, they find another way. For those that they could not incarcerate or addict to the drugs, they have now decided to feminize the males left in the household by not only bombarding them with the idea that it's okay for homosexuality to run rampant through an entire race, but they've also have bombarded them with entertainment and fashion and an assortment of different role models who ultimately indulge in the drug lifestyle as well. But ultimately, they begin to feminize the idea of African American males. Now, of course, I'm pretty sure if you listen or if you watch enough television, I'm pretty sure for just about every race, there is programming available that does portray some type of homosexuality. But the level of presence inside of the African American entertainment industry is just ridiculous. I mean, just to be honest with you, I mean, I'm speaking to you in this context because it's most professional, and in a way it's the best way to present information to people, to be direct, be square, and keep it as formal as possible a lot of times. But eventually you guys will start to hear my frustrations and my true feelings on a personal level, as opposed to just the information I'm presenting to you guys now. But again, over time, slowly but surely, these different things have been placed as hurdles for the African Americans to attempt to climb in order to make it to the end of the race, let alone have any chances of winning. And at the end of the day, all of this is a choice. For those of us who choose to indulge in drug use, drug dealing, homosexuality, it's completely a choice. And to say that because certain things have been placed in front of us, it's their fault for us to indulge in it, it's really not. It's our choice and our decision to stray away from it. But because the environment is basically set as far as the tone, and what's likely to happen just due to what's out there and what we're presented and faced with, it's still up to us to see it, understand it for what it is, prepare a solution, and effectively follow through with that solution until the issue is eliminated or eradicated. So my thing is, and of course, I would love for you guys to go back through the video a few times, check out the snippets, the charts, etc., so you can really, really see this information. All this information I'm presenting to you guys is available online, and much of them, if you look, have like direct source from where the information came from. So you can always double back and you can check out the year, the site associated with who released the information, and verify it. Please, I invite you to do so. And if you have any questions or concerns about the information presented, you can again reach me at forgottenslaves@gmail.com, and I will respond as promptly as possible. And if there's any questions or concerns that I don't have any direct answers for at this time, allow me a little bit to locate the appropriate information and get back to you as soon as possible with the most accurate answer I possibly can. And if it's a case where I can't find the answer to it, then I will let you know that as well, gladly. Um, but again, I appreciate you guys' time. This video was, again, specifically dedicated to advising just the specifics as far as just, details about how the African American household has been broken down in several ways, due in part to drug usage, drug dealing, and homosexuality. This point, guys, I hope you guys, really see things for what they are and are prepared to put action behind the thinking and the talking. Because at this point, nobody is going to change the situation for us. We must, in fact, do it ourselves. We must develop a game plan and put it into action until the final result that we're looking for is achieved. And if we don't, then not only are we risking our own lives and our own culture and our own existence in this time, but we're also risking that of our children and our children's children as well. Because the further along we get with a lot of these things, again, comfortability. Two, the further you get into a hole, the harder it is to dig yourself out. So I appreciate you guys' time. Please leave a comment, like, share, etc. Just don't report the kid. You did. But again, it's been a pleasure. You guys have a great day. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.